Alright.
Should I not be taking faces?
Yeah, I think it is recording. Your students will be watching you right now. Yeah.
I really should have told me this actually.
Holiday all the world now.
Oh, no.
This is
Yeah, okay, great. Hi, welcome to round 6. Yay, silent. On the motion about the EU not accepting refugees and of states, accept a similar number or something to that effect, I call this out of order and invite the Prime Minister to the case for round 6.
Mr. Chair, recognize the fact with millions of refugees flowing away from Syria and also potentially from Iraq being displaced continuously, these European nations can never realistically accommodate all Syrian refugees. That is why they're asking for international support from USA, from China, from countries all over the world to accept refugees as well. Also understand the fact that internationally we are losing political capital to ask countries to accommodate these refugees internationally among USA, among different countries, because they are questioning the legitimacy for them to actually accept refugees in the Gulf state in geographical proximity to not accept them, but particularly in peripheral states in Europe where a lot of Eastern European states which are crucial as the entrance to refugees are already rejecting these refugees from even entering into these states. We believe it's the duty of EU nations not just to care about short-term refugee entrance, but to find a sustainable policy that can best accommodate the maximized well-being of these refugees, and that is why this policy is necessary. What is the policy of side opening government? Firstly, we believe EU should first suspend the refugee policy that first come to place where they fairly distribute refugees to different countries. They will stop accepting refugees and treat these refugees as they have always been doing previously before they accept refugees, where they will push them to detention centers or push them back away from these countries as they've been doing so far. But second, we also say we will accept refugees again once these Gulf states also are willing to accept these refugees. How would that be decided? We believe just like the EU policy itself, we will decide about a portion of how big your economy is, how much land you have, how much space you have, just as how the EU is done, and that is how you determine similar proportions for all these states. But thirdly, we will not refuse other states around the world to accept refugees who believe that is relevant to the status of the European Union. What is the goal of side opening government? Two things. One, we want refugees to have a safe space they should go to instead of traveling to the dangerous Mediterranean Sea. Now they have a proximity where they can go to these Gulf states a lot easily. But secondly, we also believe that in the long term, this is where you improve the treatment and improve the accommodation of these refugees. In my speech, I'm going to tell you three things. First, on why principally the EU has the right to do this. Secondly, on how this is exclusively and effectively to accept more refugees from the Gulf states. And thirdly, on how by not doing this, you have to freeze the capital that we have to fight for these refugees. Are there any complication?
If your Gulf states are so empathetic and caring, what is going to make them want to care for your refugees now?
Ladies and gentlemen, as the fact you have to accept that is true, these Gulf states care about security more than anything according to the export. And that is why to me, when you stop accepting these refugees, when these refugees flow to geographical proximate areas and not just European states, that is when you increase the incentive for Gulf states to accept these refugees. But I will elaborate on more of that on second argument. But firstly, why principally believe that it's justified? Two layers of analysis. Firstly, on why Gulf states have that principle or that obligation to accept these refugees, and secondly, why the West has an obligation or right to actually stop accepting refugees until they fulfill their obligations as well. So first step of analysis. We think there are a few reasons why they should accept these refugees beyond geographical proximity. But firstly, geographical proximity is important because very often refugees do not have the resources nor tools or technology to travel far. And that's why, although the West has been trying very hard to facilitate transfer security to the Mediterranean Sea, a lot of refugees still die on the way transiting to Europe. And that's belief is problematic. But secondly, we also believe capacity is an issue because a lot of these Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, including Qatar, are extremely well funded in the sense they can provide enough financial spaces, but also space for living and working opportunities for these refugees as well. But thirdly, we believe specifically, a lot of these Gulf states are complicit or directly guilty of the crimes of ISIS. A lot of these Gulf states have been buying oil from ISIS and enriching ISIS, and a lot of Saudi Arabian princes have been funding ISIS so far, and this is what made ISIS strong. This is what made a lot of refugees displaced, because they have a duty to resolve that guilt. But second layer of analysis, why does the West have that right to do so? We believe the duty of the West is not simply about accepting some refugees, but their duty is to increase humanitarian support. This is in line with the European Commission, this is in line with what and not just doing a passive obligation, but always promoting that to the world at large. And that's why they have an obligation to even go for short-term harm in order to ensure long-term benefits to refugees. But second, we believe the duty of accepting refugees, since the global agreement of refugees has always been how we allocate duty. And that's why the agreement among European nations themselves was never about Germany absolutely accepting more refugees, but on how each country has a proportional measure of how much refugees they should accept. Duty is always relational when it comes to refugees. And that's why I believe this duty should expand beyond European nations and go to the Gulf states as well. But more importantly, secondly, why would this be more effective and why is this exclusive? So I can respond to a few items more later. What is the problem right now? The problem right now is that, one, I told you that a lot of these countries cannot accommodate enough refugees in Europe, and that is a lot harder for refugees to travel. But more importantly, a lot of these Gulf states have a sense of complacency, because they know that European nations will accept these refugees anyway. They know that a lot of Western nations are willing to offer humanitarian support. That is why it is not a problem for them, and that is why they will not want to accept the marginal risk of having terrorists among these refugees. So what's going to change after we have this policy? What's going to change is this. When you have different refugees going into different places because they simply do not have the means to be accepted by Europe, when they're turned away from Europe, they will have to steal over different places, not just of course Turkey, but also to a lot of these Gulf states. And that is when this people over effect will increase the pressure on the borders of these Gulf states. Given that ISIS has already somehow insane and declare war on Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states. A lot of these Gulf states do not want to waste their security forces just to patrol over their borders and to waste all these resources to increase that pressure that is exerting on them because of the overspill of these refugees. This is why they will have the incentive to actually work with European nations to decrease that pressure that is exerting on them, because obviously, having fewer people to press on your borders is a lot easier issue to manage. But second, we also believe this destroys their moral legitimacy as an Islamic majority state, because there are a lot of other media are banning them or blaming them because they did not accept refugees as well. Other countries refuse to do that as well. That's when, in order to not lose the legitimacy status, that's when they will confirm. What's the comparative? We argue that yes, in the worst case scenario, in the short term, yes, some refugees will suffer more because of this. But in the long term, only on our side can we be able to come up with a scenario that can better accommodate these scenarios. My partner will tell you more about how this actually better the political capital, which is losing grounds in Europe, losing grounds internationally on side of opening governments. But the thing to remember is this. Side opposition cannot simply defend and say, oh, we're going to lose lives. Side opposition is proof to us what's the comparative, but it's the best accommodate the millions of refugees that are coming over Syria and Iraq, and tell me how to have better treatments on their side, or else they will be made very proud people.
Our stance on side opposition is quite simple. We believe that this policy will ultimately be effective, but not be worse for refugees, because we actually shut them in the very same country that they were trying to save society to try to escape from in the very first place. Ultimately, we think it's counterproductive, right? So let's deal just very briefly with our policy. We think we set the status quo. We think if they have obligations, we'd like to cover take the obligation. If we choose to take action, rather than using this refugee to social battering ram of like making people depart at our borders so they overflow into the other states, let's use, I don't know, sanctions, the fact that we have alliances with these countries, we encourage taking refugees. Like, we think there are other means. We don't take the obligation to train or justify these means, but we simply say that even if those means fail, we think sending them to the EU, even if it's reaching capacity, is still better than sending them, for instance, to Saudi Arabia or the EU. Okay, so that's really our stance today. Because that's not what I'm going to cover today. Two things. Firstly, why it's ineffective. And also a big problem just generally to say that you have more obligation to take in a particular number of refugees, the same number, same proportional number as what the EU wants to take in, seems to be what the particular issue is the number of refugees as well. Right? The second thing is that there were because the kinds of countries that in Europe is a lot better for these refugees. They will put their lives back together. They will go to Europe and losses. So let's do the first principle big argument. Within that, I'll deal with the arguments coming up from finance. So firstly, taking in refugees is not an obligation under international law. If you sign a treaty, and you probably should uphold your international obligations. But given that some of these Gulf states have not signed that treaty, they don't have an international obligation. So unless they're suggesting that we can do some sort of force, which this policy does not require, we just pile them up and they can go by self-sovereignty to try them. Furthermore, the other thing that's also not, even if there was a moral obligation to help people, the key thing is that it's not clear where that moral obligation ends and where you have to concern with the well-being of your people. Right? Because let's understand this. The failure or the reason why refugees exist is because the original state, their holding state, failed. Right? So Assad has failed with ISIS. That is why we have refugees in the first place. So the primary problem is a state failure. Correct? In this particular case, then, we want to be sure that we want to deal with state failure and prevent that. So we think that in and of itself is a big issue. We think, therefore, it's important for states to decide on their own the number of refugees they take in, even if we want to borrow your obligation to take in. Why is this important? Because what they're proposing is they're taking the same number as Europe. Why is this fundamentally different? Because we think individual states should have the responsibility or they have the expertise to decide the numbers that are appropriate. Why? Because firstly, they have a sense of their own capacity, right? They have a sense of what's available. Instead, they come up and sort of simplistically tell us they have a massive GDP. That's not necessarily true about the Gulf states. Sure, they have oil, but they have other things on their hands, such as great income inequality. So we have GDP, a great income inequality, but you should be dealing with the poor, right? Furthermore, they talk about land area. No, the Gulf states don't have a lot of arable land. Right? So we don't think that this necessarily holds either. On the other hand, Europe is quite a lot of arable land. Right? So we think in this particular case, we don't necessarily have the kind of resources that they claim we do, whether it be monetary or in terms of natural resources, whether that be food or whatever, for people to be able to settle. Right? Furthermore, we also think that they seem to imply that they're doing nothing about the extremist problem. Let's recognize ISIS is not the only extremist problem that the Middle East is facing. So we think Saudi Arabia, for instance, is dealing with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? They're putting a lot of effort into that. So let's not simply vilify them as being completely useless and dealing with extremism. They themselves are trying to deal with extremism even within their own borders, something they could deal with. The key thing that really comes up this question that they should accept, or the Gulf states should accept moral responsibility for the refugees, right? People are dying, they're not doing it, especially since they funded it. Why does the EU not have this responsibility that they can abrogate it now, that they can decide, oh, this responsibility doesn't hold in this particular circumstance? They never waited up to say, why in this particular circumstance we can abrogate the very same responsibility that they're trying to hoist upon them? Yes, sir.
Do you believe that the Gulf states should do anything at all with respect to refugees?
We think they should. We don't think putting refugees on their borders and hoping that they'll overrun border guards with guns will suddenly make a difference, right? The key thing is we'd like them to do it. The question is whether this policy achieves that. It's where the debate lies. We don't think it's a question of simply allocating more responsibility and assuming it's going to miraculously solve the problem, right? So then, let me say, as I pointed out earlier, is there's an inconsistency in IIUM or inside Gulf states, right? Is that on one hand, they want Gulf states to have more responsibility. On the other hand, the EU, which played a significant role, for instance, in creating a power vacuum in Iraq, that allowed ISIS to survive in the very first place, somehow does not share that moral responsibility, or can decide that the moral responsibility turns on and off as and when they wish. Right? We don't think that's necessarily true. Furthermore, they also claim the idea of capacity. They say capacity is a problem with the EU, and it's a legitimate reason for the EU to shut its borders. But somehow when it comes to the Gulf states, this is not something that you can be concerned about, right? That the EU can suddenly decide that capacity is a legitimate reason for me to abrogate this moral responsibility. But somehow it is not something for the Gulf states to do, especially since, as I pointed out earlier, the Gulf states generally have a more pressing problem, right? Have a lot more pressing problems on their hands. We think in this particular case that we don't think it's also clear, they've never proven why they will let them in the first place. As pointed out, if they already are apathetic towards the type of refugees but it's not entirely clear why they go into the debate. But we think that furthermore, this is going to be worse off for refugees. Because their argument is, look, put them in a more proximate, especially in situations where there's increasing Islamophobia and xenophobia, it's good that they should go to another Gulf state. Let's understand this. Gulf states are like ISIS. The reason why the Saudi princes funded ISIS is because they're in leadership, right? And they have similar ideologies. The reason why many, for instance, of these Syrian refugees are running away, because Syria was fairly moderate. Assad allowed secularism to take place. For the most part, you had some degree of religious freedom. Women got to go to university, things like that. In places like Saudi Arabia, this is not the case. Right? What we simply are doing now is we are simply asking or trying to resettle Syrian refugees who are fleeing from an oppressive regime in another oppressive regime. Especially if there is a fear of security threats. What's going to happen? How do these regimes deal with security threats? They deal with them in an oppressive fashion. All the government is simply doing in this particular case is they are simply resettling refugees in an already bad society, where they're trying to flee and trying to find sort of refuge, where they're trying to find refuge in a progressive land in order to put their lives back together. Government is putting back in a similarly oppressive society.
Yes.
The status quo is this. Refugees who go into Europe right now are not caught in a luxurious life. They're stuck in camps at the borders because countries are saying no more and denying them access. So the comparative they need to defend is not refugees getting an amazing life in Europe, but refugees are getting a shit life and trapped in it in Europe, risking their lives and families on the ship in the sea. Notice that the factual inaccuracy in the characterizations of non-Saudi Arabian, Gulf states is fundamentally why oil has lost its debate from the get-start. But I want to talk about two things. Refugees are better on our side. Europe is also better on our side. I'm going to talk about that in my speech. First, let's talk about the idea of Gulf states. Because the entire case of it is, well, right now, it's really bad for refugees because the governments are suppressing it and really big numbers of refugees that were flooded. Let's walk through the statement. So, first of all, we say, right, there are certain things that you can do to make sure the lives of these refugees in these countries are less shit anyway. Number one, the very fact that refugee laws and refugee regulations associated with their protection means that within the United Nations context and HCR, which is currently championed and led by Saudi Arabia, it is often a lot easier for international organizations to already regulate to ensure that there's a minimum level of standard set. In fact, here's a comparative. In EU right now, you have two systems. You have both the EU jurisdiction and the UN jurisdiction, which means that it's very hard in current EU countries for the United Nations to come in and say, through the UN and through the EU, we'll now regulate the camps to make lives better for refugees. So the fact we say, I find it comparative, it's easier to make life less shit in Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, even if the worst scenario comes true, than in Europe. Second response is this, right? We say the reason why right now the situation in Europe is so bad is because there's a concentration of refugees in a few select ports. Here's why the quota system is important. Because the quota system is distributed. Our comparative means that you distribute these refugees so that they don't all crowd into one country, like in Europe, or crowd into one Middle Eastern country as a status quo, where you can actually allocate it across different countries, and therefore give them adequate resources and allocation resources. And now we say, on our side of the house, you're more able to absorb the xenophobic internal resistance to politics within these countries, because now you don't have to say, wow, there are 100,000 refugees. You say, okay, we did the sum, divided up, now only need care for like 3,000 refugees. So therefore, in that sense, the numbers game also favors outside. It's a lot worse on their side. Final reason why is this, right? We say, ladies and gentlemen, let's be realistic here. Saudi Arabia is rich, but so are many other Gulf states. That's why they, ultimately, when they own oil, they sell oil right now. Even with the depreciation of oil prices, they still have a very strong economy right now that allows it to support many of these refugees. Even if we have in the worst scenario that the economies are not doing so well, we still say right now for many of these countries, they're far below the saturation rate. But the second response, right, they want to then bring up the idea, well, they're already doing enough to solve other problems. Saudi Arabia dealing with Yemen, blah, blah. This is what they call mitigating our moral regulation or moral obligation, right? We think they failed to mitigate our point. Here's why. Because we think that when you have a direct impact on ISIS and the spread of ISIS and refugee crisis through, number one, controlling oil prices and creating this oil-based hegemony and supporting ISIS implicitly, know that ISIS gains most of its revenue by selling oil, and why prices are so high? Because they are propped up by these Gulf states, right? Number two, because of their meddling with the Sunni Shiite conflicts over the past years that contribute to the direct rise of wahhabism now followed by ISIS. These are direct moral obligations that you cannot steer away from by simply saying, oh, they're dealing with one country like Yemen. What about the other Gulf states? No response from their side. Sit down now. Final response is this, right? They want to talk about, is it really feasible? Will they really do that? Not only to say that it's fiat, right? But okay, let me prove this fiat to you. Number one, we say that right now, when you only have some people sneaking in by land borders to these countries, it's very easy to Saudi Arabia to say, I will shut them out. I will send one or two policemen to patrol them and keep these people out. But the analogy is this. Our comparative means that a large mass of these refugees will be pouring into these countries, and they can no longer, noting that most of these borders in this area are porous, they cannot send policemen everywhere to stop these refugees, which is why there's sufficient political capital to force them to care. But number two, this is very important, but before I go on now, yes.
It's not about fiat. Not fiat is about us saying that you will stop accepting the world.
No. Your whole challenge is about whether or not these countries will react, and we think that it is part of the motion. Anyway, let me prove it to you on the second level, right? If you want to get information, we say elites in these countries, these competitive authoritarian states, often care about what we call a facade of stability, an illusion that are able to generate harmonious society. And that's why they're gaining the legitimacy, not by rigging elections only, but largely because the people want to vote for them and believe they're doing a good job governing the countries. What you do on our comparative is that by having these refugees entering into your countries, you cause a disruption in the fabric where right now you can simply exclude in the status quo. These countries can exclude refugees. On our side, when these refugees are pouring in these countries, the people will start asking, why are we not doing something proper about this? And that is when the allocation quota system actually works. But very quickly, right, on this whole idea that Europe right now, EU can fix it, can have sanctions, all that, let me tell you this. Not only is jurisdiction an impediment, number two, the relationship between the MEP, the European Parliament, and the domestic parliament has been increasingly bad on their side of the house, because there's this idea that why aren't these Gulf states doing their job? And because of this narrative, because of this rhetoric, there's an increasing right-wingization on their side, which means refugees are not only stuck in these camps, but that is their dissolving of political capital to actually help these refugees within this camp, tying me very nicely onto my extension. Ladies and gentlemen, note the fact right now that one of the most predominant strands of narrative painted by Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, etc., is that Middle Eastern countries aren't caring for the old, so why should we care? This narrative, right, that ultimately these people belong to the other simply because the other is not taking care of them, is gaining traction and force right now simply because the Gulf states are indeed, as they say, not doing anything. So what is the Gulf state taking in them actually do in domestic territory within Europe? Number one, you confront people with reality that even when having this quota system installed, no refugees will still, want to pour into these countries, and we're happy with Europe taking in, these refugees once we've met the quota in Middle East. Note that when this happens, the people in Europe are no longer able to say, they're simply not taking or doing the job properly. They're confronted with the reality right now that, hey, the Gulf states have met this capacity. That is why, as a more developed region, Europe has an obligation to take these people in. That is when you see a transfer or transformation of paradigm from keeping these refugees in locked up, really shit camps that they want to defend on their side, to actually better welfare conditions for integration, assimilation, or at the very least minimal social welfare conditions can be supported. What? Because this is tying on to the second layer here. We think the median voter right now in Europe, having seen so many years of refugees pouring in, are becoming increasingly skeptical. They start asking, why are we doing this when other people aren't caring? Why are we giving shit when they are, right? So the idea of perceived equality and fairness is really important here, because when others, even though traditionally painted as authoritarian Middle Eastern countries, when even they are doing the job and they're even doing anything to take in more, that is when the median voter starts questioning the government and saying, hey, I want you to take in more and comply with European quotas. And that is why our side is better for refugees in both Europe and all of the Middle East. We stand for better comparative. They defend the status quo. That's why we win it. Thank you.
right, we think that everyone will want to and can look after refugees, and we do care about refugees here. But in our present world, where you are divided into states, so that each state can best manage its own people, which obviously is an imperfect system, right? Because sometimes states fall apart, as you see in Syria. Well, but in this world, we cannot force any state to override its own people and its own needs to solve this problem of a refugee crisis. Principally, therefore, we have shown you that refugees cannot be your rhetoric red or your bargaining chip. And even if they can, it's the least effective way for the EU and the international community to resolve the refugee crisis. Before I begin my rebuttals, a few clarifications. Firstly, on this whole idea that DP has brought up, that actually by proportionate, we meant proportionate to the capacity of the Gulf states. Not really, right? Because there's a word similar in motion, which basically means that the proportion means that you're proportionate to the amount of intake that the EU has already given in. Anyway, right, if you're really going to go by your paradigm and say proportionate to capacity, right, since you haven't rebutted all Becker's points about how the Gulf states' capacity is greatly limited by multiple reasons, then you really want to make a dent in the refugee crisis. Anyway, secondly, a clarification like the prop FIA, look, the prop FIA simply came out and told you that the EU state will not be able to stop the needy refugees or issue this ultimatum. We said, yeah, you can totally issue this ultimatum. The issue is that Gulf states are not going to do what you want, so your ultimatum will last for a very long time. That is not a prop FIA at all. So we don't get proper rebuttals, okay? So, first and foremost, on some basic logistical concerns they came up with, first they say, look, the EU can't handle your refugee inflow, and refugees can't handle the long travel time to the EU. Firstly, travel to Gulf states, right, entails traveling through conflict-ridden areas, so we see a great deal of danger there. But secondly, is that the international community assists in the intake and assimilation of refugees. We are happy with that, and if they can change anything, increase that instead. Second thing on logistical concerns, right? They say people are turned away at the borders of Gulf states, meet guards, and it's dangerous, and then people were sneaking, blah, blah, blah. I think that Gulf states are there to create border controls. If there is logistical need, if they have decided they don't want to take in refugees, they probably find gas costs and bring in refugees to start with. But, well, you realize therefore that this is not really a concern at all. Moving on to my second rebuttal, apathetic and caring Gulf states. So we don't really see a question in my POI, right? Why do you start caring now when you try and force things on them? Furthermore, we think it's going to turn them against you, right? Because one, I didn't just issue an ultimatum, right? And now they're going to disregard all our security concerns that we prize so much. Security being a huge concern for most states, and therefore, they're going to turn more assault and more against any refugees in the future. Especially because we see from here that their ultimatum is predicated on an accusation of terrorist complicity. Furthermore, if that accusation is true, right, we think that refugees find even more scary to go to a Gulf state that is complicit, and therefore their welfare is not protected there at all. But for now, there's really no way to force them to obey by this ultimatum. We think they lock that better to come out. Therefore, this whole idea extends to the great suffering and the detriment of refugees experience. Okay. So, third rebuttal on this relational duty and complacency. Better to you, there's no actual obligation on the Gulf states end, right? But more important, the international community gives you a responsibility to look after your own people. That's why you're sovereignty, because you're responsible for citizens already in your country. It's therefore unfair now to tell Gulf states, we give you sovereignty, next you're safeguarding your own people, but somehow that now your own people is increased as and when we feel that it's fine to issue such ultimatums. We don't think that is fair. But even if some sort of like magical duty that never heard of exists, right? You think Gulf states have their own monetary and resource constraints. We talking about things like the Houthi rebels in Yemen and a three-way war they're managing. So we don't see how they've told us that they don't have their own terrorist wars to fight as well. So, no, thank you. Just a few more things. On this idea of stability, right, and on destabilizing the Gulf, do we then realize how bad the refugee crisis is? We think really, right, you create more hostility towards trying to resolve the refugee crisis on the part of the Gulf states. Why? Because our outcomes better, so they were completely unengaged, right? That basically, no, thank you. We think that you make the Gulf states all the more hostile towards this concept, and we are going to it later by some this. But furthermore, what else then happens to your refugees? You realize that your Gulf states are as restricted as the countries you're running away from right now, right? So not to be really happy in your Gulf states, especially right now, they are openly perceived by the Gulf states as security threats. Therefore, they get a further sensitivity, further suffering. It really takes many years for you to process your applications to enter, say, European and so on, right? But now you must wait even longer, without education, without healthcare, and your family split. You put their lives on the hold into an outcome that will never truly be realized. And we don't think that life in the EU is that either, right? People right now are reinventing their lives, restarting their lives, and they enjoy the EU. We think that it's perfectly fair for refugees to go to. Before I go on closing,
if citizens in EU countries voted now to all stop accepting refugees, what would your side do to all these refugees?
First, I see a conception, right, that the EU already has gaining sentiments of xenophobia. I'm going to show you once you stop them from bringing in refugees. Once they feel like, oh, I can stop and make someone else do it, this blame which makes them all the less willing to come and do it. But for the moment, we don't really need part of the debate, right? Because it hasn't happened, so I don't see how it's going to Rather my case proper. Okay. So I'm going to show you, right, how, and this speaks to his substantives, how you encourage tribalism on the part of the international community. So what is going to happen? We realize that they came out and told us that the Gulf states will think, I need to show care for refugees now. So the EU that's terminated taking refugees will then care again, like you all care for refugees and we're all very happy. Not really, right? Because what must happen for this mentality to possibly manifest? A first cessation must happen on the part of EU states. EU was happy to bring in refugees, but now they must stop everything first before any change occurs. And once that termination is about EU, many people change. We realize that therefore, in order that EU starts very pushing, start seeing this as pure, a Middle Eastern or Muslim problem, rather than a refugee problem that everyone must come together to solve. We realize that, as they pointed out, right, existing anti-Muslim sentiments are beginning to rise in some parts of European countries. And now that people have excuse to fully distance themselves from the refugee crisis, they get easily grown up. And people can therefore say, look, we're right, let's not bring them anymore. We think the Muslim states deserve to do it, the Dutch should do it, and it's fair. Also, what's going to happen, right? In the EU, you increase xenophobia that already exists. In the EU, settling in of existing as asylum seekers therefore gets worse than ever. It's easier for people to come out and say, since this is perfectly doable, why do Gulf and without us? Why bother? Or then they come out and say, look, it's not our problem. We've done enough, let them step out. You want us to be still taking refugees? Why bother? Furthermore, with regards to Gulf states, right? They don't feel really boxed into a pro-terrorist category. They keep saying, I think you're complicit, keep redeeming yourself. I don't think that's really an impetus of us to act in collaboration and progress. We need this collaboration and unity because terrorism is a worldwide problem. It's really very hard to unite countries in the fight against terrorism, right? Given the fast spread of IS and the layers of conflicts inside the Syria. So it's going to be harder to rally Gulf states together with other anti-terrorist countries now because as a common anti-IS fight, once some of the states, i.e. the EU, take a moral high ground against others is the way to work with instead of turning themselves against. For all of example, we think to truly solve terrorism and refugee crisis, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Great, remember that.
Just sugar. I'll see in my own speech. Opening government stood up here today and talked a lot about the kinds of moral obligations every country in the world has to the refugee crisis. Coastal government's going to be a little bit more pragmatic than that, right? Like, we'll let them take the principal argument. What we're more concerned with is that recognizing that the current situation is unstable, is unsustainable, what then are we going to do to the point at which the EU decides that they are going to stop taking refugees? Where else are we going to be able to create kinds of international norms that which recognize that in refugee crisis and situations, like the way we handled in Vietnam, should be done at an international level with Australia, with the US, and now with global rising superpowers such as China, and even within the Gulf region to be able to take forefront within this entire issue. Especially given the fact that xenophobia and Islamophobia is a huge problem, which Kuwait is clearly reading that way, the issue of the economists which claim it wasn't, is like an issue right now. Especially given like the latest Paris bombings, especially given the fact that people are growing more and more resentful, that why was it always a white man's burden to take in these refugees, and why did nobody else, especially given the rising, like every time we see amazing photos of Mecca, of like Oman or whatever, why are these countries doing shit when the economies actually do really well? Two things in my speech. How do you increase the incentives for Gulf states within the region to actually deal with ISIS because we bring the problems of war right to their doorstep? Secondly, how then we create a better place for EU to negotiate within the rest of the world and help it step up as a global power. But before that, let's just deal very quickly with a few things that don't fit. Policy issues first. I don't know what their beef about numbers and similarly large refugees. I mean, like it's a really small issue. Just decide. The point is that the responsibility of the refugees shouldn't just be with the EU. Is that with like Saudi can't just take in a tokenistic number of Muslims or a number of refugees and take in like a significant number as well. We'll deal with arable land or like we'll leave that to the experts to deal with. Then they wanted to talk about how Gulf states will just put these people within concentration camps. We just think this can be modeled out, right? Because that's obviously part of the negotiation process. That obviously, as part of our terms of taking in the refugees within Europe, we're just going to say then you have to treat them fairly nicely and not atrociously as well. You can't just like stuck them in a corner somewhere and hope for them to die and then not deal with them. Like this is what we can just model that out. Now let's just deal with the bulk of case. This is the biggest tension on opening opposition's side. That we cannot force any country or citizens in any country to take in people they don't want, especially given that the government's duty is always towards its people. Guys, but we force EU to take in countries or take in these refugees, even though citizens on the ground haven't wanted these refugees in for a year, right? Even when Germany had a decrease in Islamophobia and wanted more refugees, a big bulk of conservatives within Sweden, within Hungary, within France, all said death to the refugees, kick them out of my country, right? And we think at this point in time, and this is where NUS became incredibly important, recognizing that these countries are hitting saturation point for like economics-wise as well as numbers-wise, as well as simply socially-wise, like with the tensions running high in the ground. And at a certain point, given their principle, the EU should have stopped taking these refugees in decades ago. Okay, so now that they have stopped taking the refugees, what then is going to happen? That was where our policy kicked in. If we all of us were going to be so heartless to turn these refugees away, we said that what these refugees were going to do was to then bang on the doors of the Gulf state, covered it later within my price standard. But like, they also want to talk about blame pushing, because somehow like everybody's just going to see refugees as a problem within the region as opposed to a problem within the world. This is just bullshit, because the current rhetoric towards the people who are anti-refugees on the ground are why bother? Why can't the Gulf state take them? It's more like, guys, we've given them our money, we've given them our taxpayer dollars, they're still not coming in, and these fucking rich Saudi princes are still standing by the side over there and drinking like I don't know, with their jaguars and shit, and like not doing anything, right? Like, what is the point? Like that, we think that for a decreased numbers of Islamophobia is going to happen the second you show that everybody around the world recognizes that it is a norm to take on the social responsibility within global conflicts. No thanks. I'll take closing if closing has anything. Closing. Okay.
So in this particular case then, but somehow the norm gets, you can just disregard it whenever it suits your purpose then.
No, we're saying that we're trying to build a long-term norm within the world. And this, unfortunately, is one of the few existing weapons that which the EU has to be able to galvanize change within the Gulf states. I'll deal with why your idea of sanctions and stuff doesn't work later in my second substantive. But first substantive first. How we increase incentives to deal with ISIS within these Gulf states? This is first thing we should recharacterize. Not everybody is as shit as Saudi Arabia within the Gulf states, guys. Mr. Speaker, I dated a guy with like a degree in Islamic finance. I was going to move over to the Gulf with him. I did my research. Oman isn't that shit, right? Qatar isn't that shit. Saudi is possibly the worst within the region. Even then, it's not terrible. It's taking steps towards liberalization and change. And the Saudi royalty is doing its best to deal with Wahhabi, terrorists within the region. So not everybody's that shit. But we do think that everybody is fairly apathetic for as long as the problems of war is no longer at their doorstep. In the same way that Singapore is perfectly happy to sell mines to Myanmar, but not deal with the Rohingyas as a result of the shit that we do and the problems that we cause within the Southeast Asian region. We never fully recognize or comprehend the bulk of our actions when we A, fail to act within the region, or B, continue to fund the problems within the region. So we think under these circumstances, the Gulf states, particularly the smaller states such as Oman, such as Qatar, whatever, will have more pressure with the refugees banging on their doorsteps to work together to form coalitions to deal with IS. But we also think that a lot of these rich Saudi princes currently fund IS under status quo and no more goddamn reason to fund it, right? Because more refugees will just turn up at their doorstep. They will only just hurt further the economies and further hurt the security within the region. But like, more importantly, why isn't their alternatives or sanctions going to work? Look, we recognize the EU is an incredible humanitarian body, but we just need to stop being the good guy and stop trying to take out the burdens of the world. It should attempt to push forward these burdens towards other people and stop letting other people walk over it. They suggested sanctions as a punishment. But we need to recognize that if we somehow manage to cripple the Saudi economy or cripple the entire Gulf state, sanctions aren't going to help with your rhetoric that you should take in terrorists, take in refugees, right? Because like we can't afford to take in the refugees, guys. Don't make us do it. So we needed to keep these countries as rich and as prosperous as possible in order to be able to ensure that they couldn't use like their poverty as an excuse to not take in the refugees. But we thought more importantly, using a punishment like sanctions was far less likely to work than using something that which you are like taking away a benefit you were already taking status quo. Because if we establish it wasn't a duty for the EU to take them in, if we establish the importance of the EU within the entire region, and now finally make the entire fucking world realize how much they've been doing to save the security within the region, we think that's when people will start to finally wake up. When Natalie did her research when she was dating this Islamic boy, it surprises me that she actually did her research on refugee camps and how they treated people. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm very sure her research only extended to how well treatment would be for middle-income tourists like you and I. Because I can assure you, even though these countries are very rich, the way they treat those who are lower from them and the way they treat those who cannot provide them any financial benefit is not very good. A perfect example of this is how Qataris treat their workers in building the FIFA stadium. They're rich as fuck, but they really don't give a damn about those people who can't provide them those benefits. In my speech, I'll answer to you the question, which nobody so far has unfortunately talked about, which is why we think this policy will strengthen the ISIS cause, which is exactly what we should be fearful of. And I'll do this based on two different scenarios, whether the Gulf accepts them or even if the Gulf doesn't accept them. Before that, several rebuttals. First off, what we heard from the government bench was that refugees have a safer space to go, the point at which we make Gulf states accept them, because that's really what refugees want. That is simply like assumptuous of them, right? Because I can assure you that not all refugees actually want to go to the Gulf states. Some refugees actually go to European countries because they want to, for several reasons. Number one, they see more opportunities in European countries. European countries actually care about their human rights. Thirdly, the reason why they want to go to European countries is because it's as far as possible from the conflicts that happens back home. Fourthly, is because a lot of the time European countries have governments that aren't dictated by volatile religious rulings, right? They feel a lot more secure. You're literally cutting off the one choice that refugees have a say over. That's not something I'm willing to take away from them. If anything, you feel the anti-West sentiment for making them feel that the one choice they have left now is being cut off. That's not something I'm willing to tolerate. Secondly, they said, well, we think that this policy will actually pressure Gulf states to accept them and act. Your entire case and benefit is banking on the fact that the Gulf will do several things. Number one, that in the event that a lot of refugees just run towards borders, that the Gulf isn't just going to use the money that they have to increase border security and put more men there so that more of the refugees don't come in. So I really don't see why the government will just feel like, oh, they're in a desperate situation and they're at the mercy of refugees who are a lot less fortunate and less capable than they are. But secondly, the demands of the refugees and the demands of the people don't mean jack. That's why a lot of the time these Gulf states are democratic nations, because they really don't give two rats ass about these people who are desperate and who need sympathy, right? But lastly, the sort of responses that we heard from the government bench, was that, well, at least now there is a media scrutiny over these Gulf states, that they are more likely to act. Since when has the media ever been effective in ensuring that these Gulf states change? Because if anything, that's the reason why Saudi Arabia and a lot of monarchs haven't turned into a democratic state, because the media pressure clearly hasn't overthrown their ability to cling onto their money and to cling onto their stars. We don't think this actually helps. Government cannot just come up here and say no, that the motion fiats, that the Gulf will accept. No, the motion says until the Gulf accepts. The debate is the until, right? And literally according to CO, by your policy, you will be waiting forever. We don't think that's something we want, considering the fact that you can't guarantee that. No. Given that, first question, why this will strengthen the ISIS cause? And there are two scenarios, right? First off, I'm going to tell you our case, which is why when the Gulf doesn't accept them and when these refugees are literally stuck in Syria because they have no other option because both the EU and these Gulf states don't want to accept them. But later on, I'll also talk about and try to engage with them in the worst case scenario that even if the Gulf accepts. No. So what happens when the Gulf actually doesn't accept them?
First off, we actually think people will turn to the oppressors and the ISIS for sustenance, because a lot of the times these refugees come from countries with conflict that are fueled by anger, fueled by poverty. Refugees are stuck thinking, can I feed my child? Will I live for the next day? Will my wife get raped? Everyone who is in their position are suffering equally, and they know their own home country's government cannot help. So who do they turn to for sustenance? Most likely, it's ISIS. And that's how ISIS has been generating the recruitment drive anyways, right? No, contrary to popular belief, ISIS isn't like a bunch of barbarians who eat dirt and have torn clothes. No. ISIS are rich, they hoard resources, they are smart, conniving, and very manipulative. That's why they were even able to recruit very well-educated first world nation students from Australia, Canada, and the rest of EU. If they can recruit those individuals, I'm very sure they are much more able to recruit these refugees who are on the ground, who are currently very desperate and feel like this is their only option to make sure that the rest of my family doesn't kill them, right? And this is best case scenario, assuming that they don't get killed off first before they change their mind to join ISIS. We think that's something that you need to deal with. Sure.
Can you be the first opposition speaker that makes a comparison? So there's claimants of millions of refugees that no single country can resolve. How would talking or sanctioning resolve anything?
No, right, let's be comparative. So the comparative is, given the fact that you cannot guarantee me that the Gulf will accept, right? In our world, some refugees get accepted into the EU. In your world, no refugees get accepted anywhere, until you get to convince the Gulf, which I am very sure isn't going to happen overnight. Even in the best case scenario that you get to convince the Gulf eventually, I'm very sure that eventually is going to take a hell of a lot of time. Something that we're not willing to make the lives of these individuals a social battering ground. It was easy for them to say, we get it, some refugees are going to suffer. Like, very cheeky, right? Like, they come up here and try to say, like, it's not that bad. You're literally dealing and, like, using these individuals who are the most desperate and vulnerable within our society right now as your tool to get what you think is best. We don't want that. Second scenario, right? Even if the Gulf accepts them because they are forced to, right? Because given the fact that the Gulf probably now in their world would accept for tokenistic reasons because they want to keep an eye on the refugees, fine. They will screen the refugees to see who can be accepted and who cannot. They will try to keep an eye on the refugees to ensure that they don't go rogue. But this doesn't ensure that they will give well treatment towards those refugees because they only want to accept it for tokenistic reasons, right? Natalie says, no, we can map this out because we can put also conditions and say, if you accept them, you also have to make sure you treat them fairly. The last time I checked, the motion doesn't say until the Gulf signs the UNHCR, right? You literally cannot say that this assumes well treatment. You have so many burdens to prove in order for me to make your case believable. Given the fact that Gulf states have less respect for human rights, unlike the EU, and given the fact that Gulf states aren't even signatories to the UNHCR, as a result, once again, we push the refugees to believing what the ISIS cause have been saying. Because what has the ISIS rhetoric been? That you cannot trust Gulf states. That's why we are the only caliphate of which you should associate yourselves with, because we are the defenders of Islam. The point at which these people feel they're being rejected from the EU, they're getting ill treatment from current Gulf states who are supposed to be defenders of Islam. You once again push them towards the ISIS cause. We don't think this is something we want, right? We think this is completely different in comparison to a world where they had accepted it by their own will. Because at least if the Gulf states had accepted it on their own will, they would have at least made an investment, would have made more sustainable mechanism, and probably would have signed UNHCR the way Natalie wants them to. For these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to do three things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to ask what exactly is the situation in the EU currently. Secondly, I'm going to ask how do we solve this refugee crisis at the end, and how do we galvanize the power and the support of the Gulf states to try and fight the root cause of this entire refugee crisis, which is ISIS, the ISIS conflict and the Syrian conflict. And lastly, how do we change the face of the EU within the global arena, which Yasek never wanted to respond to Natalie's analysis as a second extension. Firstly, therefore, what is the situation in EU? The first thing I would like to point out is that what closing opposition said was that the situation in the Gulf states is going to be terrible for refugees because they don't really care about the the situation or the how these refugees are treated. First of all, let's point out that on the comparative already, in the current status quo, EU is on the breaking point of trying to put all of these refugees into some form of shelter, right? They cannot even cope. So no thank you. At best, your side is in the world where the EU is the only source of shelter for all these refugees. These refugees are not going to be treated very well in the EU anyway. But what's the counter on their side of the house? Is that the more pressure you put on these European countries, the less bandwidth they have to care about the treatment and the human rights of these refugees, because they are already struggling to relocate all these people and struggling to take care of everyone who's coming in. They couldn't really care if you had enough food. They couldn't really care if you had a bed or clothes to sleep in, right? So it's not clear that your side is going to improve the situation at all. In fact, your side only makes it worse when you concentrate them so much that their situation deteriorates drastically within the EU, right? And the second thing that they want to say on closing, right, was this idea that certain refugees want to go to the EU for various reasons, job opportunities or whatsoever. Firstly, it's not clear, as I just pointed out, that just because you go to the EU, you're going to get all these grand opportunities that Amira wanted to make so important for these refugees. But secondly, even if we accept that some of them want to go to the refugees, at the point where countries like Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf states start accepting them and EU resumes their policy of doing so, then we can relocate them, and some of these refugees who want to go to the EU are very happy. We will be very happy to let them go to the EU, right? And the comparative is on our side of the house, when the Gulf states take on this burden, right? And we think they will, and we'll prove that to you. There is more political capital for us to be able to relocate them to the wishes of these refugees. So on our side of the house, we are able to take into account the wishes of these refugees better. But the last thing that I would just like to point out on this, and no thank you, is that OO's tension was like shifted down to closing opposition as well, right? But OO just stood for like the absolute right of the citizens' interest over and above everyone else's interest. In the same speech, wanted us to override the citizens' interest of the EU by forcing them and compelling them, no thank you, to take in the refugee crisis, because the EU is taking in the refugee crisis, and you're saying there's no other way, you have nothing to do, and then you can't do anything about it, just suck it up and take it out. No thank you. We think that is terrible. Secondly, therefore, how do we deal with the root cause of these refugees crisis? Right? Because we think that what all teams don't realize is that the reason this refugee crisis is ongoing and the reason that this refugee crisis is intensifying is because the ISIS conflict continues. And contrary to what opening opposition wanted to talk about, not all the Gulf states, and none of the Gulf states are like ISIS, right? If you'd like to point out, just yesterday, 34 of the Gulf states signed an agreement to battle ISIS, to set up better defense systems, to combat ISIS. So it's not true that we're not trying, that Gulf states are somehow not trying to do anything about ISIS. No thank you. But secondly, we think that like if closing opposition's problem is with like ISIS recruiting very good refugees from this country, ISIS doesn't really recruit the sort of refugee from the sort of demographic that these refugees come from. No thank you, right? Because as Nat just told me just before I came up, right? Most people tend to be like, I forgot, was this Sunni or Shia? But anyway, right, ISIS is on the other side of the conflict, and therefore they're not likely to recruit these sort of people anymore, sorry, right? But secondly, we think that that's not even true. Even if we accepted that ISIS continues to recruit people, no thank you. The fact of the matter is that many of the fighters of ISIS are becoming increasingly disillusioned. Many of the former fighters of these for ISIS are now becoming increasingly disillusioned and just want and trying to escape ISIS and escape into other countries. And the question, therefore, no thank you, is how do we increase the political capital and the military capital for us to deal with ISIS? It's when it becomes evidently clear that this is a problem to the Gulf state. It becomes evidently clear, right? And becomes viscerally clear because these refugees are banging on your door. They're trying to get in, and the reason they're trying to get in is because ISIS is behind them. ISIS is after their blood. ISIS is after the families, and all the terrible characterization, no thank you, that Amira wanted to bring out, right? For the precise reason that we need greater solidarity in our fight against ISIS, we need to make sure that Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, no thank you, have a very, very good reason to enter into the state and increase the incentive, or at least increase the harm of them not dealing with the refugee crisis, because they recognize that the refugee crisis stems from the ISIS conflict. But lastly, how do we change the face of the EU within the global arena? This is something that Amira never wanted to deal with, right? What Nat told you, and I'm going to deal with this, right? Is that what Nat told you is that currently what happens with the EU is that they are always accepting people. They're always on the defense in the sense that they're just accepting whatever burdens people throw onto them. So the whole reason there is apathy in the Gulf states is because they can always go, but the EU is going to take it anyway. The EU will find some way of resolving this problem. And why is this bad? Because it makes the EU look toothless. It makes EU a pushover that everyone can go to when they have a problem. What this policy does is for the EU to assert itself more forcefully on the global international arena. It allows the EU to use its power and tell the Gulf states that they can no longer just piggyback upon the power of the EU, that they need to deal with their problem, and that the refugee crisis is not an EU problem or a problem that someone else will pick for. It's a global effort that we need to deal with. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Gulf states do not give a single shit, right? They are willing to let children die on beaches in front of their faces if it means that they don't have to accept refugees. At the point where EU is telling them that we won't accept refugees either, the thing they're going to say is, too bad, neither will we will just let them die. There is zero cause of mechanism under this worst case scenario if they do it. But we think that we still deal with the alternative. Let's look at what I'm going to argue under my speech. Number one, is this principally justified? And secondly, will the treatment of refugees become far, far worse? A couple of things. So they said, or particularly OG said, look, O said that it's principally justified because we as Gulf states, we as states have to make sure that we can do it in the long term. But in the short term, it's a comparative, right? Because we have to maintain the moral high ground, particularly when we're telling these Gulf states that the US is in it for your own good, right? So sit down. At the point where the EU states are not accepting, they're simply seen as selfish bastards who only want what's good for themselves. If you want to dream of democracy and this anti-West sentiment to not be alive, you have to kill it by being more graceful than everybody else, not equal to everybody else. That's number one. But number two, how can you say that it is ever principally justified when hundreds of thousands of refugees are dying due to your inaction, right? Literally, the blood is on your hands, and we don't think it's ever morally applicable that these individuals will do so. So sit down. But thirdly, we think when it comes to the reason why it's so important for this for you to maintain principally justified, for you to maintain the moral high ground, is because the war on terror is necessarily an ideological one, right? For the refugee who walked through the Mediterranean Sea and then is turned out of the gate, sit down, of the border of Germany because too bad Gulf states are not accepting. That's like heartbreaking for him. He's extremely likely to turn towards IS. This perfectly leads me to my next part of this issue, right? What happens in the long term? Because there's a lot of heartache. Long term, you can't deal with it, sit down. Here's the comparative of what happens in the long term. At the point where refugees are treated like absolute trash in Gulf states, and IS, to be frank, is offering them safety, right? They are offering them homes. They pay their soldiers wages, right? That when a refugee has to think between being paid wages and treated like absolute trash, which I'll tell you why that will happen in Gulf states in my next issue, it becomes very easy to sit down for them to be wagered into that war of ISIS. That means it becomes far more difficult to take down ISIS, and the war on terror continues indefinitely. That necessarily means the creation of refugees is increased, right? Because the war lengthens,
more refugees are necessarily created due to that recruitment of ISIS. So the forced conscription, sit down, of war of these refugees means that you have the ability of the West to fight ISIS is necessarily impeded. That's extremely harmful. So the comparative is, as a long term, it's true that Gulf states have more space, but the creation of long-term refugees then means that that space will also be filled up, right? And that space will also necessarily be finished. Let's look at the next thing they want to talk about. Why are Gulf states the absolute worst? Sit down. Okay, so they said we can come in and regulate and we have UNHCR and everything. The very obvious question is, sit down, if you have the ability to come in and change and tell Gulf states what to do, why is it that EU states need to not accept refugees and get refugees overflowing at these borders? You want to know why? It's because we have literally zero leverage when it comes to Gulf states to begin with. This does not change, sit down, at the point where those Gulf states do accept those refugees. Very likely that is simply going to be tokenistic and your ability to negotiate doesn't work, right? Even if you talk about the fact, right, that they can't necessarily put police at every single border. Let's say that a refugee makes it through. And then what, right? Like he has to get a job, he has to get food. He eventually has to turn to the government. At the point where he's forced to turn towards a government that's unwilling is where they're likely to put them into slave labor camps. Sit down. And be assured here, right? The Gulf states, refugees are already dying at the border and they don't care. To them, if they die inside the border, they still will not care. Let's go on to this next thing. They had a really weird extension, right? They said sanctions are necessarily worse because we do not need because we want Gulf states to stay rich. Sanctions, let me tell you the good part about sanctions. Sanctions means we don't have to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of refugees and use them as a social battering ram to force Gulf states to accept our negotiations, right? That's what sanctions mean. Sit down. Even if there's a slightly marginally less benefit in terms of how refugees are treated inside Qatar at the point where they are accepted because they are eventually willing, then we think that's far better. Sit down. Actually, before 6, yeah.
Yeah, so your open opposition said that the wishes of the citizens are more important than the government. So how does both sides start from bleeding hearts in Europe to take in refugees, jail with open arms?
Yeah, I'm going to deal with that right now. So let's look at the willingness of refugees to go. And they said that, look, right now, our particular closing said that EU can do with it. This is completely untrue, right? Because they seriously want us to believe, or they're seriously telling us that EU will be as bad as the human rights violations in Qatar. That's complete nonsense, right? EU are at least signatories of the UNHCR. They at least have the global spotlight on them. They have huge incentives to make sure, unlike Qatar, that do not give a shit. But let's look at the willingness of the refugees to go. This is a false choice, right? You are literally choosing between being bombed. It's not because you're willing to go, it's because you're being bombed. And even then, right, what they're hearing is not the reality of what happens inside those Qatari camps. They're hearing that, oh, at least the West accepted them. But when they come there, they don't know that they're going to be treated like absolute shit. The last part that I think I want to deal with is they said, look, we want to incentivize the Gulf states because at the point where IS is fighting them, they'll feel compelled to do something. Here's the thing. Money doesn't come from the Saudi government. And let's be clear, the Saudi government is the one that's going to be dealing with the refugee crisis. The money comes from Sunni Arab oil sheikhs who believe in the same ideology that IS does. That's why they support police. So they are not going to be dealing with the refugee problem at all. It will be the government, and therefore detached from them, money will continue to flow. That's why we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thanks. Yeah, good night.
Hey, Sam, I'm gonna go steal paper. What? I'm gonna go steal paper. Okay?
Oh, you go to the break night?
With sitting on the bus to get out of town because otherwise you can't. Huh?
What are you talking
Taking the bus to head to town. Living the comfort, take the bus and then go from there.
What time is bus?
No, we're trying to, I'm trying to save my platform. So I heard, yeah, no, Yale-NUS canteen.
No,
It's nearer to city.
no, if you want to go ahead. I will see you guys tomorrow.
No, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, take care. What's happening?
Oh, this mission is already. Right. Yeah, procreate.